Hi again, and thanks for joining me for another read. I'm going to read you chapter 2 of The Wager, which is still in part 1 of this book, a book of 5 parts. I read chapter 1 just today. I was in Jersey in the Channel Islands, but actually I've now moved over to Lisbon in Portugal for the night. It is quite late outside. It is blowing an absolute gale, wind and rain battering the window. I don't know if you can quite hear it, but there's no way I'm going outside to find somewhere interesting to read you um, tonight. So unfortunately, you sat with me in here, and I'll get on to reading chapter 2. It is called A Gentleman Volunteer. Oh, I've got a friend here, by the way, as well, listening in. Who that is, but interesting anyway. So, chapter 2. John Byron was awakened by the maniacal cries of the wager's boatswain and his mates, summoning the morning watch. "Rouse out, you sleepers, rouse out!" It was not quite 4 a.m., and still dark out, though from his berth in the bows of the ship Byron couldn't discern whether it was day or night. As a midshipman on the wager, he was only 16. He was given a spot below quarter-deck, below the upper deck, and even below the lower deck, where the ordinary sailors slept in hammocks, their bodies dangling from the beams. Byron was stuck down in the aft part of the orlop deck, a damp, airless hole devoid of natural light. The only place beneath it was the ship's hold, where dirty bilge water pooled, its foul scent harassing Byron, who slept just above it. The wager and the rest of the squadron had been at sea for barely 2 weeks, and Byron was still acclimating to the environs. The height of the orlop deck was under 5 feet, and if he didn't duck while standing he would smack his head. He shared this oaken vault with the other young midshipmen. They were each allowed a space no wider than 21 inches in which to sling their hammocks, and at times their elbows and knees jostled with the sleepers beside them. This was still a glorious 7 inches more room than was allotted to ordinary seamen, though less than what officers had in their private berths, especially the captain, whose great cabin off the quarter-deck included a sleeping chamber, dining area, and a balcony overlooking the sea. As on land, there was a premium on real estate, and where you lay your head marked your place in the pecking order. The oaken vault contained the few items that Byron and his companions had been able to cram into their sea chests, wooden trunks that held all their possessions for the voyage. On board, these boxes doubled as chairs, card tables, and desks. A novelist depicted one 18th-century midshipman's berth as being cluttered with heaps of soiled clothing and plates, glasses, books, cocked hats, dirty stockings, toothcombs, a litter of white mice, and a caged parrot. The totem of any midshipman's quarters, though, was a wooden table long enough for a body to lie on. This was for amputating limbs. The berth served double duty as the surgeon's operating table, and the table was a reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. Once the wager was in battle, Byron's home would be filled with bones, sores, and blood. The boatswain and his mates, the town criers, continued bellowing and blowing their whistles. They moved for the decks, holding lanterns and leaning over slumbering seamen, shouting, "Out or down! Out or down!" Anyone who didn't rise would have his hammock cut free and the rope suspending it, sending his body crashing onto the deck. The wager's boatswain, a burly figure named John King, would not likely touch a midshipman, but Byron knew to stay clear of him. Boatswains who were responsible for herding crews and administering punishments, including lashing the unruly with a bamboo cane, were notorious bruisers. Yet there was something especially unnerving about King. A crew member noted that King suffered from so perverse and turbulent a temper, and was so abusive in speech that he could not bear with him. Byron needed to rise quickly. There was no time to bathe, which was rarely done anyway because of the limited supply of water, and he began to dress, overcoming whatever discomfort he felt bearing himself before strangers and living amid such squalor. He came from one of the oldest lines in England. His ancestry could be traced to the Norman Conquest, and he had been born into nobility on both sides of his family. His father, now deceased, had been the 4th Lord Byron, and his mother was a daughter of a baron. His older brother, the 5th Lord Byron, was a peer in the House of Lords, and John, being the younger son of a nobleman, was in parlance of the day of an honourable gentleman. How far the wager seemed from Newstead Abbey, the Byron family estate, with its breathtaking castle, part of which had been built as a monastery in the 12th century. The property, totaling 3,000 acres, was surrounded by Sherwood Forest, the fabled haunt of Robin Hood. Byron's mother had etched his name and birthdate, November 8, 1723, on a window in the monastery. The Wager's young midshipman was destined to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, who frequently evoked Newstead Abbey in his romantic verses. The mansion's self was vast and venerable, he wrote, adding that it left a grand impression on the mind, at least of those whose eyes are in their hearts. 2 years before Anson launched his expedition, John Byron, then 14, had left the elite Westminster School and volunteered for the Navy. This was partly because his older brother, William, had inherited the family estate, along with a mania that infected so many Byrons, one that eventually caused him to squander the family fortune, reducing Newstead Abbey to ruins. The hall of my father's art gone to decay, the poet wrote. William, who staged fake naval battles on a lake and fatally stabbed a cousin in a sword duel, was nicknamed the Wicked Lord. John Byron had been left with few means to earn a respectable living. He could enter the church, as one of his younger brothers later did, but that was far too dull for his sensibilities. He could serve in the army, which many gentlemen preferred, because they could frequently sit idly on a horse, looking debonair. Then there was the Navy, in which you actually had to work and get your hands dirty. Samuel Pepys had tried to encourage young noblemen and gentlemen to think of going to sea as honourable service. In 1676, he established a new policy to make his path more attractive to privileged youth. If they apprenticed on a warship for at least 6 years and passed an oral examination, they would be commissioned as an officer in His Majesty's Royal Navy. These volunteers, who often began as either a captain's servant or what was known as King's letter boy, were eventually rated as midshipmen, which gave them an ambiguous status on a man of war. Forced to toil like ordinary seamen so they could learn the ropes, they were also recognised as officers in training, future lieutenants and captains, possibly even admirals, and were allowed to walk the quarterdeck. Despite these enticements, a naval career was considered somewhat unseemly for a person of Byron's pedigree, a perversion, as Samuel Johnson, who knew Byron's family, called it. Yet Byron was enraptured by the mystique of the sea. He was fascinated by books about sailors, like Sir Francis Drake, so much so that he brought them on board the Wager, the stories of maritime exploits stashed in his sea chest. Yet even for young nobles drawn to a life at sea, their sudden change in circumstance could be shocking. Ye gods, what a difference! One such midshipman recalled. I had anticipated a kind of elegant house with guns in the windows, an orderly set of men in short. I expected to find a species of Grosvenor Place floating around like Noah's Ark. Instead, he noted, the deck was dirty, slippery, and wet, the smells abominable, the whole sight disgusting, and when I remarked the slovenly attire of the midshipmen, dressed in shabby round jackets, glazed hats, no gloves, and some without shoes, I forgot all the glory, and for nearly the first time in my life, and I wish I could say it was the last, took the handkerchief from my pockets, covered my face, and cried like the child I was. Through poor and pressed sailors were given a basic set of clothing known as slops, to avoid what was deemed unwholesome ill smells and nasty beastliness. The Navy had yet to institute official uniforms. Although most men of Byron's station could afford a flourish of lace and silk, their outfits generally had to conform to the demands of shipboard life: a hat to shield them from the sun, a jacket, usually blue, to stay warm, a neckerchief to mop the brow, and trousers, that curious fashion started by sailors. These pants, like his jacket, were cut short to keep them from getting caught in the ropes, and during foul weather they were coated with protective sticky tar. Even in these humble garments, Byron cut a striking figure, with pale, luminous skin, large, curious brown eyes, and ringlets of hair. One observer later described him as irresistibly handsome, the champion of his form. He took down his hammock and rolled it up for the day, along with his bedding. Then he hurriedly climbed a series of ladders between decks, making sure not to get lost in the interior wilderness of the ship. At last he emerged like a blackened miner through a hatch onto the quarterdeck, sucking in the fresh air. Most of the ship's company, including Byron, had been divided into 2 alternating watch parties, about 100 people in each, and while he and his group worked topside, Those previously on duty were resting, wearily below. In the darkness, Byron heard scampering footsteps and a babble of accents. There were men from all strata of society, from dandies to city paupers, who had to have their wages garnished to pay the purser, Thomas Harvey, for their slops and eating utensils. In addition to the professional naval craftsmen, the carpenters and the coopers, and the sailmakers, there were people from a dizzying array of vocations. At least one member of the crew, John Duck, was a free black seaman from London. The British Navy protected the slave trade, but captains in the need of skilled sailors often enlisted free black men. Although the society on a ship was not always as rigidly segregated as its counterpart on land, there was widespread discrimination, and Duck, who didn't leave behind any written records, faced a threat that no white seaman did. If captured overseas, he might be sold into slavery. On board were also dozens of boys, some perhaps as young as 6, training to become ordinary seamen or officers, and there were wizened old men. The cook, Thomas McLean, was in his 80s. Several crew members were married with children. Thomas Clark, the ship's master and chief navigator, had even brought his young son with him on the voyage. As one seaman observed, a man of war may justly be styled by an epitome of the world, in which there is a sample of every character, some good men as well as bad. Among the latter, he noted, were highwaymen, burglars, pickpockets, debauchees, adulterers, gamesters, lampooners, bastard-getters, impostors, panders, parasites, ruffians, hypocrites, thread-worn beaux jacques-dandies. The British Navy was known for its ability to coalesce fractions individuals into what Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson called a band of brothers, but the Wager had an unusual number of unwilling and troublesome crewmen, including the carpenter's mate, James Mitchell. He frightened Byron, even more than the boatswain. King, he seemed to burn with murderous rage. Byron could not yet know for certain the true nature lurking inside his fellow seamen, or even himself. A long, dangerous voyage inexorably exposed one's hidden soul. Byron assumed his position on the quarterdeck. Those on watch did more than keep lookout. They had a hand in managing the complex ship, a leviathan that never slept, was constantly in motion. As a midshipman, Byron was expected to help with everything from trimming the sail to carrying officers' messages. He quickly discovered that each person had his own distinct station, one that designated not only where he worked on the ship, but also where he stood in its hierarchy. Captain Kidd, who presided from the quarterdeck, was at the pinnacle of this structure. At sea, beyond the reach of any government, he had enormous authority. The captain had to be father and confessor, judge and jury to his men, one historian wrote. He had more power over them than the king, for the king could not order a man to be flogged. He could and did order them into battle, and thus had the power of life and death over everyone on board. The lieutenant, Robert Baines, was second in command on the Wager, about 40 years old. He'd served in the Navy for nearly a decade and presented certifications from 2 former captains attesting to his abilities. Yet many of the crew found him maddeningly indecisive. Though he came from a notable family, his grandfather, Adam Baines, had been a member of Parliament. They repeatedly referred to him as Beans, which, whether intentional or not, seemed apropos. He and other ranking officers on duty supervised the watch and made sure that the captain's orders were being followed. As navigators, Master Clark and his mates plotted the ship's course and instructed the quartermaster on the proper heading. The quartermaster in turn directed the 2 helmsmen, who gripped the double wheel and steered. The non-seamen who specialised in trades formed their own social unit. The sailmaker mending canvases, the armourer sharpening swords, the carpenter repairing masts and plugging dangerous leaks in the hull, the surgeon attending to the sick. His helpers were known as loblolly boys for the porridge they served. The seamen, too, were separated into divisions that reflected their abilities. The top men, who were young and agile and admired for their fearlessness, scurried up the masts to unfurl and roll up sails, and to keep lookout, hovering in the sky like birds of prey. Then came those assigned to the forecastle, a partial deck toward the bow, where they controlled the head sails and also heaved and dropped the anchors, the largest of which weighed about 2 tons. The forecastle men tended to the most experienced, their bodies bearing the stigmata of years at sea, crooked fingers, leathery skin, lash scars. On the bottom rung, situated on the deck alongside the squawking, defecating livestock, were the wasters, pitiful landlubbers with no sea experience who were relegated to unskilled drudgery. Finally, in their own special category, were the Marines, soldiers detached from the army who were equally pathetic landlubbers, while at sea they were governed by naval authority and had to obey the wages captain, but they were commanded by two army officers, a sphinx-like captain named Robert Pemberton and his spot-headed lieutenant Thomas Hamilton. Hamilton had originally been assigned to the Centurion, but he was relocated after he got in a knife fight with another Marine and threatened to duel him to the death. On the wager, the Marines mostly helped with heaving and hauling, and if there was ever an insurrection on board, the captain would order them to suppress it. For the ship to thrive, each of them elements needed to be integrated into one crisp organisation. Inefficiency, missteps, stupidity, drunkenness, any could lead to disaster. One sailor described a man of war as a set of human machinery in which every man is a wheel, a band, or a crank, all moving with wonderful regularity and precision to the will of its machinists, the all-powerful captain. In the morning hours, Byron would observe these components busily at work. He was still learning the art of seamanship, being initiated into a mysterious civilization so strange that it seemed to one boy as if he were always asleep or in a dream. Moreover, Byron, as a gentleman and a future officer, was expected to learn how to draw, fence, and dance, and to at least feign some understanding of Latin. One British captain recommended that a young officer in training bring aboard a small library with classics by Virgil and Ovid, and the poems by Swift and Milton. It is a mistaken notion that any blockhead will make a seaman, the captain explained. I don't know one situation in life that requires so accomplished an education as the sea officer. He should be a man of letters and languages, a mathematician and an accomplished gentleman. Byron also needs to learn how to steer and splice and brace and tack, and how to read the stars and the tides, how to use a quadrant to fix his position, and how to measure the ship's speed by casting a line ribbed with evenly spaced knots into the water, and then counting the number that slipped through his hands over a period of time. 1 knot equaled a little more than a land mile per hour. He had to decipher a new, mystifying language, cracking a secret code, or he would be ridiculed by a landlubber. When he was ordered to pull sheets, he'd better seize the ropes instead of his bedding. He must not speak of the privy, but rather the head, essentially a hole on the deck through which the waste plunged into the ocean. And God forbid he should say he was on a ship rather than in one. Byron himself was baptized with a new name. The men began to call him Jack. John Byron had become Jack Tar. During the age of sail, when wind-powered vessels were the only bridge across the vast oceans, nautical language was so pervasive that it was adopted by those on terra firma. To toe the line derives from when boys on a ship were forced to stand still for inspection with their toes on a deck seam. To pipe down was the boatswain's whistle for everyone to be quiet at night, and piping hot was his call for meals. A scuttlebutt was a water cask around which the seamen gossiped while waiting for their rations. A ship was 3 sheets to the wind when the sails broke, and the vessel pitched drunkenly out of control. To turn a blind eye became a popular expression after Vice Admiral Nelson deliberately placed his telescope against his blind eye to ignore his superior's signal flag to retreat. Not only did Byron have to learn to talk like a sailor and curse like one, but also endure a punishing regimen. His day was governed by the sound of bells, which measured each passing half-hour during a 4-hour watch. A half-hour was calculated by the emptying of a sand-glass. Day after day, night after night, he heard the bells tolling and the scramble to his station on the quarterdeck, his body shivering, his hands calloused, his eyes bleary. And if he violated the rules, he might be tied to the rigging, or worse, flogged with a cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with 9 long lashes that cut into the skin. Byron was also learning the pleasures of life at sea. During mealtimes, the food, consistently large, of salted beef and pork, dried peas, oatmeal, and biscuits, was surprisingly plentiful, and he enjoyed dining in his berth with his fellow midshipmen, Isaac Morris and Henry Cousins. Meanwhile, seamen gathered on the gun deck, unhooking wooden planks that hung down from the ropes from the ceiling to form tables and sitting in groups of 8 or so. Because the sailors chose their own messmates, these units were like families, and members would reminisce and confide in one another as they relished their daily ration of beer or spirits. Byron was beginning to form those deep friendships that emerged from being in such tight quarters, and he grew especially close to his messmate cousins. "I never knew a better-natured man," Byron wrote, when sober. There were other moments of merriment, especially on Sundays, when an officer might yell, "All hands to play!" A ship of war would then transform into a recreational park, with men playing backgammon and boys skylarking in the rigging. Anson liked to gamble and earn a reputation as a crafty card player, his blank eyes masking his intentions. The Commodore was also passionately fond of music, and every muster had at least a fiddler or two, and sailors could do jigs and reeled across the deck. One popular song was about the War of Jenkins' Ear. They cut off his ear and slit his nose, then with a jeer they gave him his ear, saying, "Take it to your master in disdain, but our king and I can tell loves his subject so well that he'll curb the haughty pride of Spain." Perhaps Byron's fondest diversion was sitting on the wager's deck and listening to the old salts tell tales about the sea, tales of lost loves and near wrecks and glorious battles. These stories pulsed with life, the life of the teller, the life that had escaped death before and might escape it again. Swept up in the romance of it all, Byron began with what would become a habit of excitedly filling his journals with his own observations. Everything seemed the most surprising or astonishing. He noted unfamiliar creatures, such as an exotic bird, the most surprising one I ever saw, with a head like an eagle and feathers that were as black as jet and shined like the finest silk. One day Byron heard the petrifying order eventually given to every midshipman, "Aloft you go!" Having trained on the smaller mizzenmast, he now had to clamber up the mainmast, the tallest of the three, which rose some 100 feet into the sky. A plunge from such a height would undoubtedly kill him, as it had another seaman on the wager. A British captain recalled that once, when 2 of his finest boys were climbing, one lost his grip and hit the other, sending them both plummeting. They struck with their heads upon the muzzles of the guns. I was walking the quarterdeck and presented with this most horrid spectacle. It is impossible to tell you what I feel on the occasion, or even to describe the general grief of the ship's company. Byron had an artistic sensibility. A friend said that he was drawn to connoisseurs, and he was sensitive about seeming like a delicate fop. Once he told a member of the crew, "I can bear hardships as well as the best of you, and must use myself to them." Now he began his ascent. It was critical for him to climb on the windward side of the mast, so that when the ship heeled, his body would at least be pressed against the ropes. He slipped over a rail and placed his feet on some ratlines, small horizontal ropes that were fastened to the shrouds, the near vertical ropes holding up the mast. Using this mesh of rope as a wobbly ladder, Byron hoisted himself upward. He went up 10 feet, then 15, then 25. With each roll of the sea, the mast swayed back and forth, while the ropes trembled in his hands. About a third of the way up, he came abreast of the mainyard, the wooden spar that extended from the mast like the arms of a cross, and from which the mainsail unfurled. It was also where, on the foremast, a condemned mutineer got hanged from a rope, or as the saying went, took a walk up the ladder lane and down Hemp Street. Not far from the mainyard was the main top, a small platform used for lookouts where Byron could rest. The simplest and safest way to get there was to slip through a hole in the middle of the platform, yet this so-called lubber hole was considered strictly for cowards, unless Byron wanted to be ridiculed for the rest of the voyage, and it would not be better to plunge to his death. He had to go around the rim of the platform by holding onto the cables known as futtock shrouds. These cables were slanted on an angle, and as he shinned them along them, his body would tilt farther and farther until his back was nearly parallel to the deck. Without panicking, he had to feel with his foot for a ratline and pull himself onto the platform. When he stood on the maintop, he had little time to celebrate. The mast was not a single long wooden pole, rather it consisted of 3 great sticks stacked on top of one another, and Byron had ascended only the first section. As he continued upward, the shroud ropes converged. the gaps between them growing narrower and narrower. An inexperienced climber would fumble to find a perch for his feet, and at this height there was no longer any space between the horizontal ratlines to wrap his arm around for a rest. With the wind buffeting him, Byron went past the main topmast yard, from which the second large canvas sail was fastened, and past the cross trees, wooden struts where a lookout could sit and get a clearer view. He kept ascending, and the higher he went, the more he felt the mast, and his body lurching from side to side as if he were clinging to the tip of a giant pendulum. The shrouds he gripped shook violently. These ropes were coated in tar against the elements, and the boatswain was responsible for making them that they remained in good condition. Byron confronted an inescapable truth of the wooden world. Each man's life depended on the performance of the others. They were akin to the cells in a human body. A single malignant one could destroy them all. At last, nearly 100 feet above the water, Byron reached the main topgallant yard, where the highest sail on the mast was set. A line was attached to the base of the yard, and he had to shuffle along it while leaning his chest over the yard to balance himself. Then he awaited his orders to furl the sail or reef it, roll it up partly to reduce the amount of canvas spread in the heavy winds. Herman Melville, who served on a U.S. ship in the 1840s, wrote in Redburn, "The first time we reefed topsails of a dark night, and I found myself hanging over the yard with 11 others, the ship plunging and rearing like a mad horse, but a few repetitions soon made me used to it." He continued, "It's surprising how soon a boy overcomes his timidity about going aloft. For my own part, my nerves became as steady as the earth's diameter. I took great delight in furling the two topgallant sails and royals in a hard blow, which duty required 2 hands on the yard. There was a wild delirium about it, a fine rushing of blood about the heart, and a glad thrilling and throbbing of the whole system, to find yourself tossed up at every pitch into the clouds of a stormy sky, and hovering like a judgment angel between heaven and earth." As Byron now stood at the peak, high above all the strife on the decks below, he could see the other great ships in the squadron, and beyond them the sea, a blank expanse on which he was already ready to write his own story. At 5 in the morning on October 25, 1740, 37 days after the squadron's departure from England, a lookout on the Severn spotted something in the emerging light. After the crew flashed lanterns and fired several guns to alert the rest of the squadron, Byron saw it too, a jagged outline on the rim of the sea. "Land ahoy!" It was Madeira, an island off the northwest coast of Africa that was known for its perennial spring climate. A superb wine that seemed, as Reverend Walter noted, designed by Providence for the refreshment of the inhabitants of the torrid zone. The squadron anchored in a bay on the eastern side of the island, the expedition's last stop before the nearly 5,000-mile crossing of the Atlantic to the southern Brazilian coast. Anson ordered the crews so quickly replenish their water and wood, and to load up on copious amounts of the prized wine. He was eager to move on. He had wanted to complete the passage to Madeira in no more than 2 weeks, but because of contrary winds, it had taken them 3 times that. Any lingering hopes of circling South America during the austral summer seemed to evaporate. The difficulties and dangers of the passage round Cape Horn in the winter season filled our imaginations, Reverend Walter confessed. Before they weighed anchor on November 3rd, 2 events sent further shudders throughout the fleet. First, Richard Norris, the captain of the Gloucester, and the son of Admiral John Norris, abruptly asked to resign his post. Having been extremely ill ever since I left England, he wrote in a message to Anson, "I am apprehensive my constitution will not permit me to proceed upon so long a voyage." The Commodore granted his request, though he despised any lack of valour, so much that he later persuaded the Navy to add a regulation specifying that any person found guilty of cowardice, negligence, or disaffection during battle shall suffer death. Even Reverend Walter, whom a colleague described as a rather puny, weakly, and sickly man, said of fear, "Fie upon it! It's an ignoble passion, and beneath this the dignity of a man." Walter noticed starkly that Norris quit his command. Later in the war, when Richard Norris was captaining another ship, he would be accused of betraying the greatest signs of fear by retreating in battle and ordered to face a court-martial. In a letter to the Admiralty, he insisted that he welcomed the opportunity to remove the infamy, which malice and falsehood had thrown upon me. But before the hearing he deserted and was never heard of again. Norris's departure initiated a cascade of promotions among the commanding officers. The captain of the Pearl was appointed to the Gloucester, a more powerful warship. The wages captain, Dandy Kidd, whom another officer described as a worthy and humane commander and universally respected on board his ship, moved to the Pearl. Taking his place on the Wager was George Murray, a nobleman's son who had been in charge of the Trial sloop. The Trial was the one ship with an empty commanding officer's chair. There were no more captains for Anson to choose from, and a fierce competition broke out among the junior officers. A naval surgeon once compared the jealous rivalries on ships to palace intrigue, where everyone is courting the favour of a despot and trying to undermine his rivals. Ultimately, Anson chose his dogged first lieutenant, David Cheap. Cheap's luck had turned at last. The 8-gun Trial was no man of war, yet it was a ship of his own. In the Trial's muster book, his name was now enshrined as Captain David Cheap. Different captains meant different rules, and Byron would have to adjust to his new commander on the Wager. Moreover, because of the shifts, a stranger was now invading Byron's jammed sleeping quarters. He introduced himself as Alexander Campbell, only about 15, and speaking with a thick Scottish accent. He was a midshipman whom Murray had brought from the Trial. Unlike the other midshipmen with whom Byron had become friends, Campbell seemed haughty and mercurial. Lauding his status as a future officer, every ordinary seaman, he came off as a petty tyrant who went about ruthlessly enforcing the captain's orders, sometimes with his fists. While the shake-up of commanders unsettled Byron and the other men, a second development was even more worrisome. The governor of Madeira informed Anson that lurking off the western coast of the island was a Spanish armada of at least 5 massive warships, including a 66-gun man-of-war with some 700 combatants, a 54-gunner with 500 men, and a vessel with a whopping 74 cannons and 700 fighters. Word of Anson's mission had leaked out, a breach that was later confirmed when a British captain in the Caribbean seized a ship with Spanish documents detailing all the intelligence that had been gathered on Anson's expedition. The enemy knew everything and had dispatched the armada, led by Pizarro. Reverend Walter noted that this force was intended to put a stop to our expedition, adding, "In strength they were greatly superior." The squadron waited until dark to slip away from Madeira, and Byron and his companions were ordered to extinguish lanterns on board to prevent detection. No longer were they prowling the sea in secret, they were themselves being hunted. Getting to learn a bit more about what's going on the boat. Next is Chapter 3, that's titled The Gunner, and that'll be in another reading. Thanks very much, speak to you soon.